My name is Amanda, and 24 years old, you'll never forget the exact moment my dad's life and mine completely flipped upside down. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. We were sitting at the dinner table, eating a simple dinner of rice and chicken when his phone buzzed. At first, he ignored it, muttering something about telemarketers. But then it rang again, and again. With a sigh, he finally picked it up. I remember watching his expression shift in slow motion. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed tightly, and then suddenly his whole face went pale. For a brief second, I thought something terrible had happened. But then, his eyes widened with disbelief, and an eerie silence filled the room. "Are you serious?" he shouted into the phone, his voice trembling. $56 million. I won. The fork fell out of my hand and clattered against the plate. My heart stopped. 56 million. That number was so huge. It didn't even feel real. My dad had just hit the jackpot in the state lottery, $56 million. Enough to change not just our lives, but the lives of everyone around us. For a few seconds, I just stared at him, unable to process it. My mind instantly began racing ahead, painting dreams I never thought possible. I imagined him paying off all the debts we had struggled with for years. I imagined finally being able to go to college without worrying about tuition. Maybe we could even move into a better neighborhood where we didn't have to count every single penny. But then, something changed. His joy was undeniable. But as he put the phone down, his eyes didn't meet mine with the warmth I expected. Instead, there was something darker, something I couldn't quite name in that moment: greed. He jumped up from the table, pacing back and forth like a man possessed, already talking to himself about cars, houses, vacations. He didn't even look at me. I sat there frozen, my chest tight, realizing that this money wasn't going to bring us closer, it was going to rip us apart. That single phone call should have been the best moment of our lives. Instead, it was the beginning of the worst night I would ever live through. "Are you serious?" my dad shouted into the phone, his voice echoing through the dining room. $56 million. I won. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My heart skipped a beat. My hands froze in midair, and I just stared at him. $56 million. That wasn't money, it was a dream. A fantasy. Something people talked about, but never actually touched. The silence after his words was deafening. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, and even the shallow sound of my own breathing. My dad wasn't moving either. He was trembling, clutching the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then suddenly, he burst into laughter, loud, booming, uncontrollable laughter that didn't sound like him at all. I sat there, stunned, watching as he jumped from his chair and started pacing back and forth. I knew it. I knew my luck would change. 56 million. "Do you know what that means?" he yelled, not even looking at me. In my mind, I began to picture everything this money could do. We could finally pay off the bills that had been piling up on the kitchen counter. We could fix the leaking roof, maybe even move into a safer, nicer neighborhood. I imagined myself walking onto a college campus without the crushing fear of debt hanging over me. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope that life could be different. But as my dad rambled on, his words didn't match my dreams. "A mansion," he muttered to himself. "No to mansions, cars, sports cars. Maybe I'll get a yacht. Vacations in Europe, private jets, all of it." His eyes sparkled, but not with joy, more like hunger. I smiled nervously, waiting for him to mention us, our family, our struggles. But he never did. Not once. It was as if, in that single phone call, the world shifted and I no longer existed in his plans. That jackpot was supposed to be our miracle, but in his hands, it was turning into something else entirely, something dangerous. At first, I was thrilled. My heart pounded with excitement as my mind raced ahead to everything this money could mean. I imagined him finally paying off the debts that had been weighing on us for years: the credit cards, the mortgage, The endless bills stacked on the kitchen counter. I pictured our family free from constant financial stress. No more arguments about money. No more sleepless nights worrying about what would happen if we couldn't make ends meet. For myself, I allowed a small dream to bloom. Maybe I could go to college without taking out loans that would crush me for decades. Maybe I could study something I loved instead of choosing the cheapest path. I even imagined him surprising me with a savings account, a sign that he believed in my future. But as I looked across the table at him, waiting for him to share in that same hope, I realized he wasn't seeing what I saw. His joy wasn't warm or thoughtful, it was sharp, greedy, almost dangerous. His eyes didn't shine with relief or gratitude. They glimmered with hunger. He wasn't thinking about security, about stability, about building a better life for us. He was thinking about more, always more. I could almost see the thoughts flashing through his head like neon signs, fast cars, expensive suits, a mansion with a pool, vacations in places we couldn't even pronounce. Just imagine, he muttered under his breath, pacing like a man possessed. A Ferrari in the driveway, a penthouse downtown. Everyone will finally respect me. I'll be untouchable. My smile faded. The image of him proudly paying off debts was replaced with a chilling realization that he wasn't planning for us, he was planning for himself. And in those few moments, as his gaze finally flicked toward me, I saw something I had never seen in my father's eyes before. It wasn't pride. It wasn't love. It was calculation. In that stare, I wasn't his son anymore. I was an obstacle, a reminder of the life he wanted to leave behind. And with a sinking feeling in my chest, I knew this jackpot wasn't going to bring us together. It was going to tear us apart. You know what, son? My dad said, his voice colder than I had ever heard. He didn't even look at me as he spoke, just stared off into the distance as if I no longer mattered. I don't need anyone anymore. Not even you. You're nothing but a burden. The words hit harder than any slap could. My throat tightened, and for a moment I thought I had misheard him. This was my dad, the man who had raised me, the man I trusted. Surely he couldn't mean it. But the icy emptiness in his eyes told me otherwise. Before I could even respond, he stood up, walked to my room, and started tossing my things into a small duffel bag. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just cold, mechanical movements, as if I were a stranger he couldn't wait to be rid of. Dad, wait, I started. But he cut me off with a glare so sharp it silenced me instantly. Minutes later, I was standing on the front porch with that single bag of clothes in my hand. The door slammed behind me, and I heard the click of the lock slide into place. That sound echoed in my chest like a final verdict. I stood there in the darkness, staring at the house I had called home all my life. The same walls that once echoed with family dinners, birthday celebrations, and quiet nights now felt like a fortress I was banished from. My own father had cast me out, trading blood for greed. The street was quiet, but my heart was in chaos. 1,000 thoughts rushed through my head. Where would I sleep? How would I survive? Why wasn't I enough for him anymore? The night air was cold, biting against my skin as I slowly walked away. My bag felt heavier with each step, not because of what was inside, but because of the weight of betrayal I carried. I thought that moment was the end of everything: my home, my family, my connection to my dad. But as much as it hurt, I had no idea that this cruel exile was only the beginning, because within 24 hours, the same man who threw me away would come crawling back, begging for my help. The streets were cold that night, and so was my heart. The air carried a sharp chill that cut through my thin jacket, but it was nothing compared to the ice settling inside my chest. I couldn't believe it. My own father, the man who had raised me, who taught me how to ride a bike, who promised he'd always be there for me, had turned his back on me the very moment fortune entered his life. Every step I took away from that house felt unreal, like I was drifting through someone else's nightmare. The glow of the porch light behind me grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely, leaving me in darkness. That was the house I had grown up in, the only place I had ever truly called home. And yet, in a matter of minutes, I had been erased from it like I never belonged there. All the streets were quiet, eerily quiet. No cars, no voices, just the sound of my shoes scraping against the pavement. I clutched the duffel bag in my hand, the one he had thrown my things into as if I were nothing more than an unwanted guest. That bag held everything I own now, a few shirts, some jeans, and a toothbrush. My entire life reduced to a handful of items stuffed carelessly together. I replayed his words in my head. You're nothing but a burden. The words echoed like a cruel chant, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. I wanted to believe he hadn't meant them, that maybe it was the shock of winning that had twisted his mind. But the cold way he said them, the look in his eyes when he shoved me out, those weren't accidents. That was the truth as he saw it. I paused on the sidewalk, staring at the night sky. The stars looked distant, unreachable, just like the man who had once been my father. I felt small, abandoned, and unwanted. A part of me wanted to scream, to cry, to bang on the door and beg him to let me back in. But I didn't, because deep down, I already knew the man I thought I knew as my dad was gone. And as I kept walking into that cold, empty night, I had no idea that his new fortune would soon turn into his greatest curse. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch that night, carrying nothing but my duffel bag and a heart that felt like it had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. The couch was old, its cushions sagging, and the blanket they gave me was thin. But I was grateful. At least I had a roof over my head. At least someone still cared enough to open their door. But lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the silence felt heavier than the room itself. My mind refused to rest. Instead, it kept replaying the scene over and over again. My dad's voice, sharp and cutting, telling me I was nothing but a burden. Each time those words echoed in my head, the pain grew sharper, like pressing on a wound that refused to close. I thought about all the times I had stood by him, the sacrifices we had made as a family, the nights I heard him complain about bills and tried to cheer him up. I thought about birthdays, about moments when I thought we were close, and now none of that seemed to matter to him. In the face of money, I had been erased. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to fight off the cold not just from the room, but from inside. My chest ached with a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. Why wasn't I enough? Why was money worth more to him than me? I told myself to stay strong, that maybe he just needed time, that maybe this was shock and excitement talking, not the man I had known my whole life. I whispered excuses into the darkness, trying to convince myself that he would call, that he would regret what he had done, that this was temporary. But deep down, I knew those were just fragile hopes keeping me from falling apart completely, because the truth was, he hadn't just thrown me out of his house, he had thrown me out of his heart. As I lay on that couch, exhausted but unable to sleep, I realized something painful. I wasn't just homeless, I was fatherless. Still, I tried to make excuses for him. I told myself over and over again that money changes people. Maybe the shock of suddenly becoming a millionaire had scrambled his thoughts. Maybe the excitement had blinded him to what truly mattered. People did crazy things when their lives flipped upside down, right? I clung to that thought like a lifeline. It was easier to believe he was confused than to accept the possibility that my dad truly meant the words he said. I imagined him waking up the next morning, realizing what he had done, and calling me with an apology. I imagined him saying, "Son, I was wrong. Come home. We'll figure this out together." Deep down, I wanted to know, needed to believe he would remember I was his son, not a burden, not an obstacle. His son, the same boy he once carried on his shoulders at the fair, the same kid he taught to throw a baseball, the same teenager he hugged after my first heartbreak. Surely those memories still meant something to him. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way he looked at me that night, not with love, not even with pity, but with something worse, indifference, that haunted me more than his words. At least anger would have meant he cared. But the cold dismissal in his eyes was like a door slamming shut forever. Even so, I convinced myself it wasn't final. I told myself that once the initial rush of excitement wore off, he would remember who had been by his side when things were hard. He would remember the years we scraped by together, the nights we went without so he could pay the bills. Surely, he couldn't just erase all of that in a single day. So I waited. I checked my phone constantly, hoping for a message or a missed call. Each vibration made my heart race, only to crash in disappointment when it wasn't him. Hours stretched into the longest night of my life, and as the minutes dragged by, one truth became harder and harder to ignore. Maybe he really had forgotten me. Maybe, in his new world of wealth, there was no room left for me at all. But the very next morning, reality shattered that fragile hope I had been clinging to. I was sitting on my friend's couch, bleary-eyed from a sleepless night, when the TV flickered on, and there he was, my dad. He stood on a stage, smiling ear to ear, surrounded by flashing cameras and microphones. In his hands was a giant check for $56 million, the kind you only ever see in commercials or news reports. His smile stretched so wide it almost looked unnatural. But the crowd loved it. Reporters cheered, photographers snapped pictures, and strangers clapped like they were witnessing a hero. I leaned forward, waiting. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd say my name. Maybe he'd talk about his family, about how we had struggled, and how this money would change everything for us. But instead, he said something that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "This is the best day of my life," he declared, his voice booming with pride. The best day of his life. Not the day I was born. Not the moments we had shared together. No winning money had replaced all of that. And he didn't stop there. He went on and on, bragging about all the things he planned to buy. A brand new sports car, a mansion with 10 bedrooms, vacations in Europe, cruises around the world, private jets. His eyes sparkled as he spoke, but none of that sparkle was for me. He never once mentioned his son. Not once. It was as though I didn't exist. I sat frozen, my chest tightening with every word that came out of his mouth. I felt invisible, betrayed, and utterly forgotten. Just hours before, I had convinced myself he would remember me, that he would come round. But seeing him there celebrating his new life without me made the truth impossible to ignore. He hadn't just turned his back on me. He had erased me completely. I turned away from the screen, unable to watch anymore. My fragile hope crumbled into dust, replaced by an ache so deep it made me feel hollow. I thought I had lost everything the night he kicked me out, but now I realized I had lost him long before that. What I didn't know then was that his dream life was already cracking at the edges, and it was about to collapse faster than it had even begun. Less than 24 hours after my dad's life had changed forever, he discovered that winning the lottery was not the blessing he had imagined. It was the beginning of a nightmare. His phone, once something that rang only occasionally, now buzzed so constantly that he could barely hear himself think. At first, it was innocent enough. Old friends he hadn't seen in years suddenly wanted to reconnect. "Congratulations, man, you deserve it," they'd say, as if they had been close all along. He answered those calls with pride, soaking up the attention. But it didn't stop there. Within hours, his phone was flooded with messages from people he barely remembered. Distant relatives he hadn't spoken to in decades suddenly acted like they were family again. Cousins, uncles, and even a few people who claimed to be related but weren't, all had the same theme to their words: "Don't you think you should share the wealth?" At first, he brushed it off with jokes. "I'll see what I can do." He laughed, thinking it was harmless. But the tone shifted quickly. The congratulations turned into pressure. Calls at midnight. Voicemails filled with guilt-tripping. Messages that sounded less like requests and more like demands. Don't forget who was there for you when you had nothing, one relative hissed. Another simply wrote, "We deserve a cut. Don't make us ask again." And then came the strangers, somehow. His number had leaked online, and people from all over the country began reaching out. Fake charities claimed they needed urgent donations. Businessmen promised him investments that would triple his money overnight. A few tried to tug at his heartstrings, sending pictures of supposed sick children with pleas for help. My dad, once confident and proud, started to feel trapped by the sheer weight of it all. The final blow came when one caller didn't ask, but demanded. His voice was cold, sharp, and threatening. "You've got money now. Don't be selfish. Partner with us or you'll regret it." My dad hung up, but his hand trembled. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just about money, it was about survival. It didn't take long for my dad's win to go from celebration to chaos. By the next morning, his name was everywhere on the news, on social media, even trending hashtags online. His smiling face, holding that massive check, was plastered across headlines. But it wasn't just the win that people knew. Somehow, his personal information, his address, his phone number was leaked and spread like wildfire before he could even process it. The quiet neighborhood we'd lived in for years had turned into a circus. News vans lined the street, blocking driveways and shining bright lights at all hours. Reporters shoved microphones at his face every time he opened the door, asking about his plans, his money, and his personal life. What started as applause quickly turned invasive, suffocating. The neighbors weren't much better. The same people who used to wave politely and borrow sugar were now whispering in corners, their smiles twisting into jealousy. Some pretended to be supportive, but their eyes betrayed them. They wanted a piece of the pie. A few even knocked on the door outright, just to check in. But the conversation always turned toward money. And then came the strangers. Cars he didn't recognize pulled up in front of the house at all hours. Some people came with rehearsed sob stories, sick children, medical bills, financial disasters. They cried on his porch, begging for just a fraction of his winnings. My dad, trying to be kind at first, gave small amounts away. But kindness has a price. Word spread that he was giving handouts. Suddenly, there was a line of desperate faces at his front door. When he finally started refusing, the mood shifted instantly. The pleas turned sharp. Voices that once trembled with fake tears now hissed with anger. "How can you be so selfish? You've got millions, and you won't share." One man spat. Another growled. "People like you end up regretting choices like that." The mansion he dreamed of buying hadn't even been finalized yet, but already his modest home felt like a fortress under siege. The locks on the doors seemed weak, the windows too exposed. What used to be his sanctuary now felt like a prison, surrounded by vultures, all circling, all waiting for their chance to strike. My dad thought money would buy freedom. Instead, it shackled him tighter than ever. The worst part was, my dad practically painted a target on his own back. In the rush of excitement, he wasn't thinking clearly. He wanted to show off, to prove that he had made it. That meant bragging loudly and recklessly. The night he won, he wired thousands of dollars to a man he'd only spoken to twice over the phone. This business partner promised him returns that sounded too good to be true because they were. But my dad didn't care. He was on a high, convinced his money could only grow bigger. Then he started running his mouth to anyone who would listen. At the corner store, he talked about the new luxury cars he was ordering, even though they hadn't been delivered. At a neighborhood barbecue, he bragged about buying a mansion with a private pool and theater. Every word was like blood dripping into the ocean, and the sharks were already circling. At first, it was slick talkers in suits, financial advisors, and investment managers who showed up with glossy brochures and fake smiles. They promised to double his winnings if he just signed on the dotted line. But when he hesitated, their tone shifted. Suddenly, they weren't smiling anymore. They leaned in, their voices lower, sharper. "Opportunities like this don't wait forever. one man warned. Then came the real predators, loan sharks, and outright criminals. They weren't interested in pitches or contracts. They wanted control. They told him he had to partner with them, whether he wanted to or not. And when he tried to stall, the warnings turned into veiled threats. You wouldn't want something bad to happen, would you? One said with a smirk. Another muttered, money like yours attracts problems. You'll need protection. My dad, once so proud and loud, started looking over his shoulder everywhere he went. The thrill of winning was gone. The joy had evaporated. All he felt now was fear. He had spent his whole life dreaming of freedom, believing that wealth would solve every problem. But in less than a day, he had gone from a lucky man to prey in the water, surrounded by predators who wouldn't stop until they got their bite. By that evening, my dad was drowning, and not in riches, but in the chaos that came with them. His phone buzzed nonstop, every vibration sending a fresh wave of anxiety through him. At first, he had answered every call, still riding the high of his winnings, but now, every new voice on the line seemed darker, colder. Some demanded money outright. Others threatened him when he refused. A few made it clear they knew where he lived. His so-called friends, the ones who had laughed with him at bars, shared meals, and called him brother, suddenly vanished when he stopped handing out free cash. They weren't friends at all. They were scavengers, quick to circle when there was something to take, but just as quick to disappear when there wasn't. And those smooth-talking business partners, they shed their masks too. They weren't legitimate investors or advisors. They were criminals with ties to dangerous circles. People who operated in shadows where money wasn't just power, it was survival. They didn't care about contracts or numbers. They cared about control. And men like my dad, flashing wealth without protection, were nothing more than prey. For the first time, the reality of his new life sank in. The lottery hadn't given him freedom. It had stripped him of it. He couldn't walk outside without being watched. He couldn't answer his phone without fearing the voice on the other end. He couldn't trust a soul around him. Sitting alone in his grand, half-empty house, he felt the weight of it all pressing down. The laughter he had once shared with others was gone. The joy of celebrating his win had evaporated. He was surrounded by silence, broken only by the buzzing of threats that came through his phone like clockwork. And that's when it hit him, not as a gentle realization, but as a punch to the gut. In his arrogance, in his hunger to celebrate his fortune, he had burned the only bridge that mattered. He had pushed away the only person who had ever truly cared about him. Me, his son. The cruel irony was clear. He had millions of dollars, but not a single person in the world he could trust. I was sprawled out on my friend's worn-out couch, half asleep, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. The room smelled faintly of old pizza and detergent, the kind of temporary space that reminded me I didn't belong anywhere anymore. My phone buzzed beside me, lighting up the dark with a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I ignored calls like that. Spam, scams, wrong numbers. I had no patience for them. My thumb hovered over the decline button, ready to send it to voicemail, but for some reason I paused. Something in my gut told me to answer. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was fate. I swiped. Son. Just one word, a single syllable, whispered and shaky. But it sent a jolt through my chest. I knew that voice. I'd grown up listening to it, sometimes booming in anger, sometimes sharp with criticism, but always unmistakable. It was my dad. My breath caught in my throat. The same man who had slammed the door in my face, who had told me I was nothing but a burden, was now on the other end of the line. But this wasn't the confident, self-assured man who had strutted across the TV screen with a giant lottery check in his hands. This voice was different, weak, frayed, almost childlike. I froze. My first instinct was anger. A flood of memories crashed over me. His cold eyes when he told me to leave, the humiliation of being cast aside like I was disposable, the nights I lay awake wondering why I wasn't enough. And now, He was calling me. Of all people, my chest tightened, and for a moment, I almost laughed. The bitter irony of it was overwhelming. He had $56 million, everything he ever wanted. What could he possibly need from me, the son he abandoned without a second thought? But then I heard it, something I hadn't heard in years, something that pierced through the bitterness and caught me off guard. His voice cracked as he spoke again, trembling like he was barely holding himself together. Whatever was happening on his end, it was serious. He wasn't calling to boast, to gloat, or to rub his riches in my face. He was calling because he was scared, and despite everything he had done to me, I couldn't hang up. Please, he stammered, his breath uneven, each syllable trembling as though the word itself was too heavy to carry. I need your help. For a second, my thumb hovered over the screen, ready to end the call. My instincts screamed at me, hang up. This was the same man who had tossed me out like yesterday's trash, who told me I was nothing but a burden. He hadn't wanted my presence when he had nothing, so why should I give him my attention now that he had everything? But then, something in his voice cracked. Not arrogance, not anger, not even shame. It was fear, raw, bone-deep fear that I had never heard from him before. His words spilled out in fragments, broken like shattered glass. He wasn't safe. Men were outside his mansion, his brand new palace of luxury pounding on the gates, demanding more. He admitted he had already given them thousands, desperate to keep them quiet. But it wasn't enough. Now they wanted everything. I could hear muffled noises in the background, thuds, maybe fists on the door, maybe boots against metal. And in that moment, the image of him smiling on TV, with his giant check clashed violently with the picture I had in my head now, a man cowering in his own house, surrounded by wolves. Please, son, he whispered again, his voice breaking. They won't go away. They'll kill me. I don't know what to do. I sat there in silence, my grip tightening round the phone until my knuckles turned white. A storm of emotions whirled inside me. Anger, resentment, bitterness, but also something else. Something harder to admit. Pity. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't hear my father, the cold, dismissive man who had shut me out. I didn't hear the smug lottery winner who thought money made him untouchable. What I heard was a man stripped bare of everything except his fear, and the truth hit me harder than I expected. My dad had no one, no friends he could trust, no allies to protect him, no family except the son he had abandoned. And now, against every piece of logic in my head, he was reaching out to me. His words echoed in my mind, replaying like a cruel joke. You're nothing but a burden. That sentence had cut deeper than any blade the night he said it. It wasn't just rejection, it was the moment he had stripped me of my worth, shut me out of his home, and made me feel like I didn't matter. I had carried those words like a scar, convincing myself I would never forget or forgive them, and now the same man was on the other end of the phone, his voice cracking, his pride gone, begging that very burden to save him. For a second, the urge to laugh bubbled in my chest. The irony was almost poetic. He had thrown me aside when he had nothing, and now that he had everything, he was crawling back. I wanted to spit the words back at him, to remind him of every cold look, every slammed door, every time he made me feel small. I wanted him to choke on the weight of his own cruelty. But then his voice broke again, trembling with panic. Son, he whispered, almost too softly to hear. I know I was wrong. I know I don't deserve this, but you're the only person I can trust. The desperation in his tone cut through my anger like a knife. This wasn't the man who had grinned on TV holding a giant check. This wasn't the father who had shoved me away without a second thought. This was someone stripped bare, trembling in the shadow of his own mistakes. And the bitter truth was impossible to ignore. Out of all the people in his shiny new world, his friends, his so-called business partners, even his own neighbor's eye was the last one left. The son he had rejected was suddenly his lifeline. I should have felt triumph. I should have savored the bitter justice of it all. Instead, I felt something heavier pressing down on me. Pity. Because no matter how deep my resentment ran, I could hear he was terrified. And beneath all the anger, all the scars, a small part of me still remembered what it was like to want my father's approval, to want him safe. And that part of me couldn't just hang up. I sat frozen, staring at the dim light of my phone screen, as if it held the weight of my entire past. My grip was so tight my knuckles burned white, yet my hand refused to let go. On the other end of the line, I could hear him, his breathing ragged, uneven, filled with a kind of fear I had never once associated with my father. He was terrified, and in that moment, I realized something chilling. He was right. There was no one else he could call. Everyone else had vanished the second the money stopped flowing. The fake friends, the smiling business partners, the relatives who had come crawling out of the woodwork, all of them had turned their backs, just like he had once turned his back on me. The irony made my chest ache. Part of me wanted to let him sit in that fear, to let him taste every ounce of the loneliness he had forced on me. It would have been so easy to hang up, to silence the call and go back to pretending he didn't exist. For a flicker of a moment, I almost did. But then, against my will, memories slipped through the cracks. I remembered being a kid, riding on his shoulders at the fair. I remembered how proud he looked when I brought home my first trophy from school. Those moments were buried under years of coldness and cruelty, but they were still there, whispering in the back of my mind, and those whispers made it impossible to ignore the truth. As much as I hated what he had done, he was still my dad. The silence between us stretched like a wire about to snap. I could hear him shifting, holding his breath, waiting for my answer, probably convinced I would cut him off just as easily as he had once cut me off. And then, without even realizing it, I spoke. "Okay," I said at last, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tell me where you are." It was a choice born out of equal parts anger, pity, and something I couldn't quite name. But deep down, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever happened next, this decision would change everything for him and for me. I met him at a small diner far from the flashing cameras, the shouting reporters, and the chaos outside his mansion. He had chosen a booth in the back, where the hum of the old ceiling fan drowned out most of the noise. When I walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. This wasn't the proud, smiling man from the news, clutching his oversized lottery check. This wasn't the arrogant father who had once told me I was nothing but dead weight. No, sitting in front of me was someone completely different. His eyes were bloodshot, swollen from nights without sleep. His once expansive clothes were wrinkled, stained even, hanging loosely as if he hadn't cared enough to button them properly. His hands shook uncontrollably as he clutched his coffee cup, and every few seconds his gaze flicked nervously toward the diner's front door. He didn't look like a millionaire. He looked like a broken man. The moment he saw me, his lips trembled. "Son," his voice cracked, and before I could even sit down, he started apologizing over and over. Words tumbled out like water breaking through a dam. "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I should never have treated you that way. Please forgive me." I sat quietly, letting him pour it all out. His apologies didn't erase the years of pain, nor did they erase the bitter memory of being cast aside. But as I studied him, I realized something. He wasn't just asking for forgiveness. He was begging for survival. His fear wasn't just of losing money, it was of losing everything, including his life. For the first time, my dad didn't look untouchable. He looked human, and maybe, just maybe, that was the start of something neither of us had expected. After his flood of apologies, I leaned back and simply asked, "What do you want me to do?" He swallowed hard, his hands trembling worse than before. "I can't fight this alone. They won't stop. They know where I live. They know what I have. If I don't give them everything, they'll They'll hurt me. His voice cracked on the last words, like a child confessing a nightmare. I should have felt triumph hearing that the great lottery winner, humbled and powerless. But what I felt instead was something else. Pity. He had been blinded by greed, and now the same greed had left him defenseless. So I made the only choice that made sense. We're going to the police, I told him firmly. He looked at me, startled, as if the idea had never crossed his mind. Maybe he thought he could buy his way out of every problem. But this wasn't a problem money could solve. This was a problem that required honesty, humility, and courage, things he hadn't used in years. Together, we left the diner and drove to the police station. The whole ride, he sat stiff, constantly checking the mirrors, jumping at every pair of headlights behind us. By the time we walked into the station, his shirt was damp with sweat, and his legs almost gave out beneath him. For hours, we sat with investigators. My dad laid out everything: the scammers, the fake business partners, the loan sharks, even the so-called friends who had threatened him. His voice shook, his face pale. But he didn't hold back. For once in his life, he wasn't trying to brag or hide. He was just a man begging for protection. The police took it seriously. They ranged security, made calls, and began tracking down the scammers. Slowly, the storm began to quiet, though not without damage. By the time it was over, nearly half his winnings were gone. Millions wired to fake accounts, millions wasted on promises of fast returns, millions stolen under threats and lies. I watched as he stared at the numbers on the official reports, his lips moving silently as if trying to add them up himself. His shoulders slumped lower with each line he read. The proud man who once bragged about cars, houses, and vacations now looked like he had been stripped bare. The reality hit him like a hammer. Money without wisdom is nothing but kindling waiting to burn. For me, though, the loss wasn't shocking. I had seen it coming the moment his name hit the headlines. Money draws predators, and my dad had painted himself like fresh blood in the water. But even then, I didn't take a cent, not a single dollar. Not because I didn't need it, I did, but because I wanted him to see what real value looked like. I wanted him to understand that the one thing he had thrown away, the thing greed had blinded him to, was the only thing he actually needed. Family. That night, after everything was finally over, we sat together in silence. His house was quieter than ever before. No news vans, no fake friends knocking at the door, no scammers lurking outside, just silence. He sat at the dining table, staring at the reduced figure in his account, millions gone in less than a week. His face was pale, empty, as though the weight of it all had finally crushed the arrogance out of him. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling. Son, I thought money made me powerful. I thought it made me untouchable. But the truth is, his eyes met mine, and for once, they weren't filled with pride or judgment. They were filled with regret. Without you, I was powerless. Those words struck harder than any apology. For the first time in years, he wasn't just my dad, he was a man who had finally understood the cost of greed. He had $56 million in his hands, enough to buy houses, cars, anything he could dream of. But it had taken nearly losing everything to realize the one thing money could never buy: loyalty, love, and family. As I sat there, I didn't feel like a burden anymore. I felt like the one thing he had left that truly mattered. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth more than millions.